morning was still dark when Holt Calder walked to the edge of the paddock and looked at the horse. He had bought the animal 3 weeks prior from a cattleman passing through Copper Bend on his way south, and the price had been low enough to make any sensible man suspicious. Now, Holt understood why the stallion, a blue roan with a white blaze running crooked down his nose, had put 2 of Holt's hired hands in the dirt on the first day. On the second day, it had broken a fence rail and earned itself the name Roan. On the morning of the 3rd week, standing in the gray pre-dawn with his breath clouding in the November cold, Holt Calder accepted what he had been slow to admit. He did not know what to do with this horse. Behind him he heard the sound of boots on frozen ground. He turned. Coming up the road from town was a woman he recognized from a distance, which was the only way most people in Copper Bend knew her anymore. She walked with a bedroll strapped across one shoulder and a canvas bag over the other, and she moved with the careful steadiness of someone who had learned to take up very little space. Her name was Ada Voss. She had arrived in Copper Bend 4 months before with her husband, a land speculator from the back east named Gerald Voss, who had ridden out on a Tuesday morning and never came back. What he left behind was a wife with no means, no family within 500 miles, and a story that the town had already written for her before she could speak a word of her own. They said she was cursed. They said Gerald had fled her. They said a woman who couldn't hold a husband couldn't hold much else either, and they had said it loudly enough and often enough that Ada Voss had stopped trying to correct them and started moving through Copper Bend like a woman who had made peace with being invisible. Holt watched her approach. She was going to pass the paddock without stopping. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, the way her eyes stayed on the road ahead, as though looking sideways might give someone an excuse. He said, "Can you break this horse?" She stopped. He had not planned to say it. It had come out the way things come out before you've thought them through, and now it was between them in the cold air, and he couldn't take it back. She turned and looked at him, then looked at the roan in the paddock. The horse was standing at the far end with its head high, watching them both. She said, "What happened to the men who tried?" Holt said, "One has a cracked rib. The other one quit and went to Billings." She looked at the horse for a long moment. Then she looked at him. She said, "I'll need the paddock to myself. No spectators, no noise, no interference. I'll need 3 days." He nodded. She said, "And I'll need a place to sleep that isn't a boarding house." Mrs. Hartwell raised her rates, and I'm not in a position to argue with her about it. Holt said, "I have a spare room. It's small and cold, but it's there." That was how it started, not with a handshake or a contract or anything so formal. Just a woman setting her bedroll down inside a stranger's door, and a blue roan horse in a paddock, watching the fence line like it was planning an escape. Before I go any further, I want to ask something of you. If this story finds you in it, if something in Ada Voss feels familiar, I want you to hit like and subscribe so this story can travel. Leave a comment and tell me what city or state you're watching from. I want to see how far this goes. Now, back to Copper Bend, Montana, in the autumn of 1873. The town had been built around a copper deposit that played out faster than anyone expected, and what was left was a settlement that had decided to become a ranching community mostly by necessity. There were 2 saloons, a general store, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and a livery run by a man named Pete Osgood, who had opinions about everything and shared them freely. There was also a small land office that had once belonged to Gerald Voss, now locked and dusty, its windows filmed with road grit, a reminder sitting right on the main street of Copper Bend that speculation was a fine idea until it wasn't. Ada had come to town as a wife and stayed as something the town didn't quite have a word for. Not a widow, because there was no body. Not a divorcee, because there had been no papers. Just a woman whose husband had ridden east one morning with a saddlebag over his shoulder and not come back. And the town had looked at that absence and decided it said something about her. She had done laundry for 3 families through September and October, hauling water and wringing sheets in the cold behind Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house, until her hands cracked and bled. She had mended harness leather for Pete Osgood's livery at 3 cents a strap. She had taken in sewing for the schoolteacher and the wife of the land surveyor who had come through in early autumn, and she had been quiet and careful and made herself useful in every way she could think of, and none of it had been enough to change what Copper Bend had decided to think about her. The currency of a small town is reputation, and Ada Voss had arrived with a husband and lost him inside a month, and that was the whole of her account as far as most of Copper Bend was concerned. Women stopped their conversations when she walked past the general store. The minister's wife had been pleasant once, on the first Sunday, and had not repeated the experiment. Even the families whose laundry Ada washed accepted their folded sheets from her at the back door rather than the front, as though whatever had settled on her might transfer through the linen. She noticed all of it. She filed it away the way you file away weather, as something you endure rather than something you argue with. Holt Calder was not a man who paid much attention to what the town had decided to think. He was 38 years old and had been running his ranch, Calder Creek, alone since his father died 6 years prior. The ranch sat 4 miles north of Copper Bend at the base of a long ridge, and it was a working place without pretension, the barn older than the house. The fence lines replaced section by section as Holt had money, which was not always. He ran a small herd of cattle, kept 6 horses, and grew enough hay on the flat ground near the creek to see his animals through winter if the season wasn't too hard. He was not unfriendly, but he was not social in the way that small towns expected a man to be. He did not drink at the saloon, or attend the church socials, or position himself at the general store on Saturday mornings, when everyone came in from the surrounding ranches and stood around talking. He came to town when he needed something, and went home when he had it, and Copper Bend had filed him away in its mental ledger as decent but private, which was the most charitable thing it said about anyone who kept to themselves. He had not hired Ada Voss out of charity. He wanted to be clear about that in his own mind, and he was. He had watched the roan for 3 weeks. He had tried 2 capable hands and watched them both get thrown. He had read the single chapter on difficult horses in a ranching manual his father had kept on the shelf above the stove, and it had told him nothing he hadn't already tried. When Ada Voss came up the road that morning with her bedroll and her canvas bag and stopped at the sound of his voice, she had looked at that horse the way you look at something you understand, and that was what made him speak. She was up before him the next morning. He heard her moving in the kitchen at what must have been 4 in the morning, soft footsteps and the small sound of the coffee pot being set on the stove. When he came down, she already had her coat on and was wrapping her hands in a pair of his old work gloves she had found on the shelf by the door, too large for her by half, but folded back at the wrist to free her fingers. She didn't ask him for anything. She took a tin cup of coffee and went out into the dark. He stood at the kitchen window and watched. The paddock was 40 yards from the house, and she went to the fence rather than the gate, and she stood there in the pre-dawn cold, without moving, without making a sound, while the roan watched her from the far corner. The horse had its head up and its ears forward in the alert, compressed way it held itself when it was ready to move fast and hard. Ada didn't acknowledge that. She just stood there, with her coffee going cold, the way you stand when you are waiting for something that cannot be rushed. The sky went from black to the dark blue of very early morning, to the pale gray of a November dawn, and by the time the first thin light came over the ridge, the roan had dropped its head a degree. Not much. But Holt had been watching closely enough to see it. She came back in when the sun was up, ate a biscuit standing at the counter without sitting down, and went back out. By the second afternoon she was inside the fence, not with a saddle or a rope, She went in, empty-handed, and stood near the gate, and she waited. The roan came at her twice, fast and low the way it had come at the hired hands, and both times she stepped to the side at the last possible moment, not scrambling, not flinching, just moving with a quiet accuracy, as though she had known where the horse was going to put its feet before it had decided itself. The second time it came and she stepped, it pulled up short and stood there blowing, confused in the way that animals get confused when the thing they expected to frighten doesn't frighten. The third time it approached it came slower. She didn't move toward it. She waited until it was close enough that she could have touched it, and then she put one hand against the side of its neck, without pressing, just resting there, and the roan shuddered once from its ears to its haunches and stood still. She stayed that way for a long time, hand against the horse's neck, both of them breathing in the cold air, while the afternoon light came sideways across the paddock and turned the dust gold. When she came in at dusk, she sat at the kitchen table and ate a bowl of beans and didn't say anything. And Holt didn't say anything either, and the quiet between them was more comfortable than he would have predicted. On the morning of the third day, he rose earlier than usual. There was something he had been expecting, not knowing quite what it was, and he didn't want to miss it. He was right to get up early. She had the roan saddled before the sun was fully over the ridge. She did it slowly, the way you do something you've done 1,000 times, and don't need to hurry. She talked to the horse while she worked, low and continuous, not words he could make out from the fence, just sound. The roan stamped once, when the girth tightened, but didn't fight it. She ran her hand along his neck, waited until his breathing evened, then put her foot in the stirrup. The horse threw its head and stepped sideways, and she went with it, her body loose in the saddle, not gripping, not correcting, just staying with him. He took 2 steps sideways and 1 step back, and then stopped, and she sat there on his back in the early morning light, with the reins easy in her hands and her face completely still. Then she put her heels gently to his sides. He walked, first in a tight, uncertain circle near the gate, then wider, and then, as the morning light strengthened and the cold air came off the ridge and the frost on the fence rails began to catch the sun, he walked the full perimeter of the paddock with a long, reaching stride, his head low, his ears relaxed. A different animal entirely from the one that had broken a fence rail and put 2 men on the ground. She rode him out at dawn, through the paddock gate, down the track that ran alongside the creek, out into the open ground at the base of the ridge, where the frost-killed grass was silver in the early light. Holt watched her go from the fence, watched the roan stride open up as the ground opened up, watched the horse carry her south along the tree line, and then turn and come back, moving freely, as though something that had been locked had come loose. When she came through the gate and dismounted, she was breathing hard from the cold air. She patted the roan's neck once and gave him a piece of dried apple from her coat pocket, and the horse took it from her palm with the gentleness of an animal that has decided the world can be trusted. She looked at Holt. She said, "He's not mean. He's been handled wrong. There's a difference." He said, "I can see that now." The problem was that Pete Osgood had been coming up the road to the livery that morning and had stopped at the sound of hooves. He had watched Ada ride out and come back, and he had seen the way the roan moved, and he had drawn the conclusions that Pete Osgood always drew, which were the conclusions that made the most interesting story, rather than the most accurate one. By the time Holt rode into town that afternoon for supplies, it was already a different version of events. The way Pete had told it at the general store, Ada Voss had ridden that animal into the ground and broken its spirit, which said everything about a woman who would do a thing like that. The way Pete had told it at the saloon, she had probably used some kind of trick, because a woman, especially that woman, had no business knowing what she apparently knew. Holt had listened without interrupting. Then he said quietly that he had watched every minute of it, and it was the most careful and considered piece of horsemanship he had seen in 38 years, and Pete was welcome to come to Calder Creek and judge for himself. Pete had not taken him up on the offer, but someone else had. Her name was Dorothea Ames, and she was the widow of the man who had, until 3 years ago, owned the largest ranch in the valley. She had come into her late husband's holdings by default and had been running them by sheer stubbornness ever since, and she was respected in Copper Bend in the particular way that only women who outlast their critics get to be respected. Not warmly, not universally, but genuinely, by the people whose opinion was worth having. She came to Calder Creek on a gray morning in the second week of November, with 2 of her hands riding behind her. Ada was at the paddock fence watching the roan, who was walking the perimeter with a relaxed, almost thoughtful quality to his stride, nothing like the animal who had put 2 men on the ground 3 weeks before. Dorothea Ames studied Ada for a long moment. Then she looked at the horse. She said, "Mrs. Voss, I have a mare, 4 years old, good breeding, went sour during a hard foaling season, and hasn't been right since. I'll pay you $15 if you can sort her out." $15 was more than Ada had made in all of October. She said, "I'll need a week in the animal to myself. Bring her tomorrow." Dorothea nodded and turned to go, then stopped. She said, "I've heard what they say about you in town. I want you to know I'm not interested in what people say. I'm interested in what I just watched in that paddock." Ada said, "Then we understand each other." The mare arrived the next morning, a blood bay with a white sock on her left hind leg and eyes that showed too much white around the rim. She came off the wagon with her tail wrung and her ears pinned flat, and one of Dorothea's men had a long scrape on his forearm from the loading. Ada spent the first day doing nothing but being present. She moved around the paddock slowly, always in the mare's peripheral vision, but never approaching, never asking for anything. She spoke in a low, even voice, not to the horse particularly, just adding her voice to the air the way you add wood to a fire, steadily and without drama. When she brought water, she carried it herself in a bucket rather than pointing the mare at the trough, because the trough was at the far end near the gate, and the gate was where the frightening things had come from. The second day she stood closer. The third day the mare took a step toward her. Holt saw it. He had taken to sitting on the top rail of the adjoining fence in the evenings after the day's work was done, his coffee going cold in his hands while the light faded off the ridge. He told himself he was keeping an eye on the animals. He knew that was not entirely true. There was something in what Ada did that was worth watching, in the way that a thing done very well is worth watching, not for what it produces, but for what it shows about the person doing it. It was patient and careful and so attentive that it made him feel he had been moving through his own days in a kind of half attention, not quite seeing what was in front of him. He thought about the roan and how he had looked at that horse for 3 weeks and seen only a problem. Ada had looked at it for 3 days and seen an animal that had been mishandled and was protecting itself the only way it knew how. He wondered how many things he had looked at like that, seeing the surface difficulty and not the cause underneath. He thought about Gerald Voss, not with judgment, because he didn't know enough to judge. He thought about the shape of the absence Gerald had made, the locked land office on the main street, the woman wringing laundry at the back of the boarding house, the town that had looked at all of it and decided she was the reason. One evening toward the end of that week, she came out of the paddock and found him at the fence. He said, "You learned this somewhere." She said, "My father. He could settle any horse you put in front of him. He used to say that most people want an animal to obey them, and the animal can feel that wanting, and it puts them on edge. He said you had to get curious about the horse before you could ask anything of it." Holt thought about that. He said, what did he do when he couldn't figure one out? She said, he sat with it, sometimes for days. He said the answer was always there. You just had to be quiet enough to hear it. There was a pause between them. The evening had gone dark blue and cold, the kind of cold that settles in when the sun drops below a ridge rather than a horizon, sudden and complete. He said, what do you need? She looked at him, not the question she had been expecting. She said, after a moment, I need to stop being invisible. Not to be celebrated, just to be seen accurately. He nodded. He understood that. He had his own version of it. The man who was decent but private. The man the town had decided not to need. He had made a kind of peace with it. He wasn't sure it was the right kind. The week the mare came right, 3 other ranchers sent word to Calder Creek. Holt hadn't advertised. Word had moved on its own, the way word moves in a valley where everyone knows everyone. And Dorothea Ames is not a woman who keeps good news to herself. There were 2 horses from the Ames ranch, a young gelding from the Purdy family who had gone barn sour and would not load, and a 4-year-old stallion from a rancher named Cross, who had ridden over from the next valley specifically to ask. Ada took them in sequence. The Ames horses she worked together, running them in the same paddock so they could steady each other, and within 4 days both of them were coming to her hand. The Purdy gelding was a different problem. Not fear, but habit. The habit of balking that had been allowed to set until it felt like character. She loaded and unloaded him 12 times in a single afternoon, each time calm, each time without punishment, until the gelding stepped into the wagon the 13th time with his ears forward and his breathing easy, and the Purdy boy, watching from the fence, let out a long, slow breath like he had been holding it for an hour. The Cross stallion was the hardest. He was a big gray with a scar along his left shoulder that told its own story. And he was not afraid in the way the others had been afraid. He was angry, in the deliberate, sustained way of an animal that has decided anger is the only reliable response to a world that has not been fair to it. Ada spent 3 days just watching him before she went near him, studying the way he moved, where he put his weight, which direction he turned when he was unsettled. On the 4th day she went in and stood with her back to him, which was not what he expected, and his anger had nowhere to go. By the end of the week he was following her around the paddock like a dog. Cross stood at the fence and watched, and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said he had been told she was in trouble. He said he had almost not come. Ada didn't respond to that directly. She said, he'll need handling with patience going forward. He doesn't trust quickly, but he'll work for anyone who earns it. Cross looked at the gray stallion, who was standing at Ada's shoulder with his eyes half closed in the weak November sun. He said, I'll send you my cousin's horse next month if he's willing to make the ride. She's got a filly that's been a puzzle since spring. Ada said, tell him to come. The snow came early that year, a light fall in the 3rd week of November that dusted the roof lines and put a skim of ice on the water trough each morning. Holt brought the roan into the barn, and Ada came down before first light to check him, and the barn in the early mornings became a place where things got said that might not have been said anywhere else. There was something about the low light, and the smell of hay, and the sound of horses breathing in the stalls that made the air between 2 people easier. She had reorganized the tack room at some point in the first weeks, and he had noticed without saying anything because the new arrangement was plainly better. Every piece of equipment where you could reach it without moving something else first. She had found a crack in the water barrel and repaired it with tar before it became a problem. She knew where everything on the ranch was now, and what state it was in the way that a person knows a place when they have been paying close attention to it. One evening in late November, while she cleaned the roan's hooves and he repaired a section of headstall by lantern light, she said she had been watching the roan run. He said, I know. I've seen you. She said, he covers ground differently from most horses. There's something in the way he extends at the gallop, the way his hind legs come under him. I think he's been misread. The cattleman who sold him probably thought he was difficult. I think he's fast, unusually fast. I think if you ran him a straight quarter-mile, you'd find out you bought something you didn't know you were buying." Holt was quiet for a moment. He said, "You're telling me I have a racehorse?" She said, "I'm telling you the man who sold him at a loss didn't know what he had. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am." He turned that over for a long time after she went inside. He thought about what it meant that a woman who had been walking past this paddock on her way to somewhere else had looked at a horse he'd been despairing over for 3 weeks and seen something he hadn't seen. He thought about how many things were like that, how much was missed by people who had already decided what they were looking at. In the first week of December, the trouble came. A rancher named Burl Sickles, whose temperament had always run toward suspicion, had been at the saloon 2 nights running when Pete Osgood was in full voice, and he had come away with a version of events that suited his temperament perfectly. Ada Voss, a woman with something wrong about her, had installed herself at a decent man's ranch and was taking money from ranchers who didn't know better, using whatever had made her husband disappear to cloud the judgment of men who ought to have more sense. It was not a version that bore examination, but Burl Sickles was not an examining sort of man, and Pete Osgood was not helping matters, and the story had circulated from the saloon to the general store to Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house, where it acquired details it had not started with. What reached Holt first was a letter. It came from Burl Sickles, not anonymously. Burl was not that subtle, and it said that a man of Holt's years ought to know when he was being taken advantage of, and that whatever Ada Voss had done to Gerald, she might equally do to a rancher who was letting her use his property to run what amounted to a confidence scheme on his neighbors. Holt read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Then he folded it and set it on the shelf above the stove, where he put things that required a response, and he went out to the barn and worked on the fence sections that needed replacing before the hard winter came, and he thought. That evening, he found Ada at the paddock fence in the dark. She had her hands in her coat pockets, and she was looking out at nothing in particular, which was the way a person looks when they are thinking about something they haven't decided yet. He stood beside her. The roan came to the fence between them, his warm breath smoking in the cold air. Holt said, "I got a letter from Burl Sickles today." She didn't turn. She said, "What did it say?" He told her, plainly, the whole of it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you believe it?" He said, "I think you broke that horse, and I watched you do it. I think you sorted out 5 more horses that nobody else could manage, and I've watched ranchers I respect come here and see it for themselves. I think whatever Gerald Voss did or didn't do has nothing to do with any of it, and I think Burl Sickles and Pete Osgood between them don't know more about horses than you know in your smallest finger." She looked at the roan. She said Gerald wasn't a bad man. He was a frightened one. He borrowed money he couldn't repay, and when it caught up to him, he didn't know how to face it. So he didn't face it. He just left, and I was the thing he left behind, and this town looked at me and decided I was the reason. Holt said, "I know." She said, "I'm not cursed. I'm just a woman whose husband ran away." He said, "I know that too." She turned and looked at him with a directness that was particular to her, the kind that did not permit evasion. She said, "I need to know something. Not about the letter. About you." He waited. She said, "I've had 2 offers this week. Dorothea Ames wants me on permanently. Cross sent word that his brother-in-law has a ranch in the next county and is looking for someone who knows horses. I could leave Calder Creek tomorrow, and I would be working and housed inside for a week." He said, "I know that too. She said, "So I'm asking why I'm still here." He understood the question. It was not really a question about her reasons. It was a question about his. He said, "I'm not asking you to stay because I need help with horses." She held his gaze for a long moment. The cold moved between them. She said, "What are you asking?" He said, "Nothing yet. I'm just answering what you asked." She looked back at the roan. The horse had dropped his head and was resting a hip, comfortable in the way that horses get when they feel safe. She said, "All right." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a resolution. But it was enough for the night, and they went in out of the cold, and the roan stood in the dark paddock, with his head low and his breathing slow, and the frost came down over Copper Bend, and morning was a long way off, but it was coming. Holt wrote back to Burl Sickles the next morning. The letter was short. It said that he had watched Ada Voss work 6 horses in 5 weeks, and the results spoke for themselves, and that any man who wanted to form an opinion was welcome to come to Calder Creek and look. It said that what had happened to Gerald Voss was Gerald Voss's business and had nothing to do with the question of whether Ada could handle horses, which she plainly could. It did not say anything intemperate, because Holt was not an intemperate man, but it was clear, and he sent it. Burl Sickles did not respond, but he did not come to Calder Creek either, which was its own kind of answer. Pete Osgood was a different matter. Holt rode into town the following Thursday for supplies, and he tied the roan at the hitching post outside the general store. And when he came out, Pete was standing on the steps of the saloon across the street looking at the horse. Pete said, "Heard that animal is working right now." Holt said, "He is." Pete said, "Suppose the Voss woman had something to do with it." Holt said, "She had everything to do with it. She had him figured in 3 days. My 2 best hands couldn't do it in 3 weeks." Pete was quiet. Then he said, "She really rode him out?" Holt said, "At dawn on the 3rd day. Down along the creek and out onto the flat ground. He moved like a different horse. Because he was a different horse by then. She did that." Pete looked at the roan for a long time. The horse stood at the hitching post with his head easy and his eyes quiet. The patience of an animal that had made its peace with the world. Pete said, "I may have said some things without knowing what I was talking about." Holt said, "You may have. If you'd like to know what you're talking about, you're welcome to come out and see." He untied the roan and swung up, and he rode back toward Calder Creek, and the matter was left there for Pete Osgood to do something with or not, which was as much as you could do. In the 2nd week of December, the snow came in earnest, a 3-day fall that buried the fences to the second rail and turned the road into a white ribbon between white fields and made Copper Bend very quiet. The world contracted to what you could see from your own window, and what Holt could see from his was Ada in the barn doorway every morning at first light, checking the horses, her breath clouding in the cold air, moving from stall to stall with the unhurried purposefulness of someone who has been doing necessary work their whole life. Pete Osgood came out on a Saturday afternoon in January. He said he had a question about a piece of harness. Holt suspected the harness was a pretext, but he did not say so. He took Pete to the barn, and Ada was there. And Pete asked his question, and Ada answered it. And then there was a silence, and Pete said he might as well look at the roan while he was here. Ada brought the horse out of his stall and put him through his paces without being asked, walking and trotting in the barn aisle, letting Pete see the quality of him, the reach of his stride, and the steadiness of his eye. Pete watched with the attentiveness of a man who has spent his whole life around horses and knows what he is looking at. When Ada put the roan back, Pete said, "That's a different horse than the one Calder bought in October." Ada said, "He was always this horse. He just needed someone to find him." Pete turned that over. He looked at the stall door, not at Ada, and he said, "I said some things around town, About you. I said them without knowing what I was saying. Ada said, I know what you said. Pete said, I may have been wrong. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, you were wrong. But you came out here, and you looked, and that counts for something. Pete nodded. He picked up his hat from the hook by the barn door and put it on and went out, and Holt, who had been at the far end of the barn checking on the hay supply, heard the whole of it. He waited until Pete's horse was out of earshot. Then he came down the aisle and stood in the light from the open barn door. He said, you didn't have to give him that. She said, I know, but a person who will come out and look is different from a person who won't. I'd rather have him on the right side of it. On a morning in late January, with the snow deep on the ground, and the mountains white above the valley, and the cold so sharp that the air tasted of iron, Holt Calder put 2 cups of coffee on the kitchen table and sat down and waited. Ada came downstairs as she always did, already in her coat, already moving toward the door. She saw the cups and stopped. He said, sit down for a minute. She sat. The coffee steamed between them, and outside the window the world was white and still. He said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to hear the whole of it before you answer. She waited. He said, you have more work than you can take on coming into spring. Dorothea's offered you a permanent position. Cross has his cousin's filly, and probably 2 more horses behind that. You could build something in this valley that belongs entirely to you, with your name on it and nothing of Calder Creek attached. She said, I know that. He said, I'm asking if you'd be willing to build something different, something that belongs to both of us. The ranch, the work, the rest of it. I'm asking if you'd stay. She was quiet for a long time. Outside the barn the roan moved in his stall, a muffled knock of hoof on wood, and then was still. Somewhere high on the ridge a wind had come up, and it moved through the pines with a sound like water. She said, when you asked me that first morning if I could break that horse. He said, I remember. She said, I had decided I was invisible, and that invisible was safe. I was going to walk past your paddock and keep going until I reached somewhere that didn't already have a story about me. He said, what made you stop? She said, you asked like the answer mattered to you, not like you needed someone to do a job, like you were genuinely asking me. He said, I was. She said, I know, that's why I stopped. She looked at her coffee. Then she looked at him. She said, yes, I'll stay. I'll build it with you. They finished their coffee without hurrying, and then she stood and went out to the barn, and he went out behind her. And the cold air hit them both at once, and the snow was bright enough to hurt your eyes. The roan heard her boots in the barn aisle and put his head over the stall door, ears forward, waiting. She put her hand on his face, and he leaned into it. Holt stood beside her and thought about the morning he had watched her ride that horse out at dawn, down along the frost-killed grass by the creek, and out onto the open ground, the roan's stride opening up as the ground opened up, carrying her south toward the tree line as the sun came over the ridge and turned everything gold. He had stood at the paddock fence and watched them go, and he had known then, though he had not had words for it yet, that something had changed at Calder Creek. Not just the horse, something larger, something that had been waiting to change for a long time. What they built over the following years was known in the valley as the place you sent a difficult horse. The roan, as Ada had predicted, turned out to have a stride that covered ground the way few horses did, and ranchers came from 3 counties to watch him run and made offers that got larger every season. Holt and Ada declined all of them. Some things were not for sale. The town of Copper Bend revised its opinion of Ada Voss, the way towns revise things, slowly and without ceremony, through a long accumulation of small corrections. Mrs. Hartwell, who had amplified the worst of the stories, became conspicuously quiet on the subject, which was as close to a retraction as Copper Bend usually got. Dorothea Ames continued to speak well of Ada to everyone she knew, which was considerable. New ranchers who came into the valley heard the name Calder Creek and knew what it meant, and they did not know the old stories, and after a while the old stories had fewer people willing to tell them. It was not a vindication so much as it was an erosion, the wrong thing wearing away until what was underneath it was visible. Ada did not wait for it. She had the work, and she had the ranch, and she had the man who had asked the right question at the right moment on a cold November morning. Every dawn that winter she rode the roan out along the creek and onto the open ground at the base of the ridge, and the horse carried her with that long, free stride that had always been in him, that no one had bothered to find until she did. She had been told she was cursed. She had been told she was finished. She had been told that a woman like her, abandoned and unchosen, had no future in a valley that had already made up its mind. She had ridden out at dawn anyway. That was always going to be the answer. Thank you for riding along to the end of this story. If Ada Voss meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe before you go. These stories travel because you carry them, and knowing you are out there is what keeps them coming.